Kyle here from allmediareviews.blogspot.com, and I wanted to do a short or long, hopefully short, of a video just about, not the recent PROG Awards, I guess, the recent PROG Awards to a point. Every year they've done this, they just did the PROG Awards in England, which PROG Magazine, which is associated with classic rock magazine, they call Team Rock, the 5th annual. And award shows generally don't mean a heck of a lot, although it's more enjoyable to me to look at the results, look at the nominations, predict the nominations or predict the results, and then criticize them, sort of like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and some other lists and that kind of stuff, even like Watch Mojo. But the thing is, it's like with PROG Magazine, when that came out, it wasn't 5 years ago, it was probably like almost 10 years ago. It was kind of exciting, although there's been other progressive rock magazines. There's Progression Magazine, there was, not Extreme, it was called something like that. Yeah, it started with an E. I'll remember it, like Exclaim. I'll remember it later, of course, I won't remember it when I'm making this video. Expose, that's the one I'm thinking of. There was Expose, Music News Network, which Christine Holtz I know from some of the festivals and stuff. But anyway, there had been previous progressive rock, and then of course magazines and stuff that had been made prior to PROG Magazine. But it was based out of England. They had more money, because Classic Rock Magazine and all their other offshoots, Metal Hammer, they have more money obviously to publish a more impressive, at least visually, they just had more resources and more money to put into it. And I always wanted to support them, although the price was definitely often more money than I'd want to pay. The price would end up being $15, $16, $17. That's like buying an album or more. Now I'll confess, once I started seeing my fiance, she worked at Barnes & Noble for a number of years, I could actually save, I could pay about half price on it. But my biggest beef though with it as it went along after a few years, right away even, is they had a huge bias toward England, British music, British rock, that kind of stuff. And they weren't covering a lot of stuff around the rest of the world, specifically North America. I'm from North America, I'm from Minnesota, I obviously have a bias toward that. So I suppose Progression Magazine, which was published by a guy, I think it was in Boston where he's from, somewhere out east, maybe there was more of a bias on Progression Magazine on the North American progressive rock, I don't know. But it irks me. Now, of course, myself, like Lorenzo from altprogcore.com, my friend Niche, there's some other people that have done blogging for progressive rock. There's a lot of people I'm not even thinking about. People I know online, journalists, a guy named Jordan, something like that, who I know, and Anil, who does has a website called Interviews, like interviews, INNER, doing a lot of cool reviews and interviews of progressive rock figures. There's a lot of other media resources, You've Been Radio, you name it. Now the PROG podcast that's been the last couple of years, the PROG Squad. So there are other things other than PROG Magazine, and then there are PROG Awards now, but it still continued to sort of have this bias just in Europe. The band seemed to either have to be able to tour over there, or someone on the staff has to be a huge fan, or they have to be really big for them not to be really covered that much by that magazine if they're not from England or parts of Europe, it seems. That's just my impression. Maybe I'm off by that, but I just know there's certain bands that especially the bands that they consider the quote-unquote outer limits or prog in a different way that aren't being your traditional, yes, Genesis, which of course that's true. Obviously progressive rock, the roots and the large majority of its origins are from England. But in progressive music, that's still not completely giving credit to other parts of the world and parts of North America that had a lot of it and have continued it, especially in the 80s and on, since progressive metal, the heavier side of progressive rock, or heavier kinds of progressive rock and progressive metal, is probably more so based in North America than other countries, although there's obviously progressive metal from other parts of the world and outside of England too. But your Dream Theater's on the modern day. Dream Theater is maybe the biggest name. But I just have a problem with the fact that, like my favorite musician Kevin Gilbert's never been talked about in there. Or they did do a thing on Jellyfish once, but the Deer Hunter, I think maybe they finally have covered the Deer Hunter, because Deer Hunter's toured over there a little bit finally in the last few years. But, like Dredge, The Mars Volta and Coheed and Cambria, I'm sure I've gotten their coverage over there just because they're just big enough names. And Muse, of course, because they're from England. But, you know, Ocean Size and Pure Reason Revolution, British bands. But like Caddisfly never got mentioned in there, I'm sure. Caddisfly wasn't that big, but they were relatively large. You know, a lot of my favorite modern bands of the last 20 years just have failed to even be mentioned in there. Ben Sinister finally did it after they finally toured with, was it Flying Colors, I think, over there. And that's my frustration. Then you talk about their quote-unquote awards show, and the nominations are so almost entirely they're largely European again, and my favorite music doesn't show up. Small League Sink Ships, they don't have a clue who that is, you know, and that was my favorite album of 2015. You know, their new album, you know. I'm just trying to think of, just this past year, you talk about the last 12 months, you know, the new Fates Warning wasn't on their nominations list, neither was Cloud Cult. When has Cloud Cult ever crossed their radar? Oh, they're not, they don't sound like Yes or Genesis or Pink Floyd. It doesn't really matter to me. It's still progressive to me, and their new record is tremendous. Granted, they're not the only ones. Cloud Cult's new album hasn't received even half the amount of attention I would have expected it to, but what can you do? I've been through this so many times before. I mean, you know, you just go Pepe Deluxe. You go down the list of the last few of some of the best music that I've loved. You know, if they're not from England, I mean, I'm going to think of some others from North America. Phenomena, never been mentioned in their magazine, I'm sure. You know, let's just see here. Some of the bands from out east, like East of the Wall, the metal bands especially. You know, Between the Buried and Me finally, and they were on the nominations list. They've been around how long? Over a decade. They're finally getting mentioned in that magazine. I mean, and they were on some of the tours. They've toured Europe. Has 3 ever been mentioned in there? I doubt it. You know, it's just this is a kind of a soapbox and a you know, hyperbolic rant that I've always done. I've wanted to actually do more extensively in my blog too, about PROG magazine, and they don't really represent my taste exactly. I mean, they do to a point, but it's like, you know, why aren't they talking about, you know, the Red Painting's new album? You know, why aren't they talking about, they never met, again, Dredge is one of the biggest, Fair to Midland never got mentioned in there. I don't even, Carnival maybe, even though they're from Australia, they've at least lasted, whereas Fair to Midland broke up, unfortunately. You know, there's so many bands over the last decade and a half especially. You know, I mean, if they're not from, Pain of Salvation's been mentioned there because they're from Europe. That's about the only explanation I can come up with. Whereas, like, I don't know, I mean, I should just have a list. I could just come up with a list just on my Rate Your Music page. I mean, you know, I should make a list on my blog of bands that PROG magazine's never covered. Let's see here. Like Jane's Addiction. Jane's Addiction, I mean, granted, they're not exactly prog, but they were art rock. You know, I'm not even talking about newer bands. Sabotage, they ever talked about Sabotage? Not that I know of. I would probably buy an issue of that magazine. King's X. When have they talked about King's X? King's X has been around how long? 30 some odd years? They're doing a tour. Their drummer, obviously, has gone through, you know, multiple heart attacks. You should talk about them while they're still alive. You know, this is where my beef is. You know, I mean, let's see here. Brooke Wagner, you know, are classically influenced. She could be talked about in that magazine. Let's see here. Well, even Archive, who's from England, I would think would be called Agalock. You know, you want Kimbra, commercially visible, almost as visible as say like Muse. Has she ever been talked about in prog? Because she's pop. Oh, but she's also a big fan of the Mars Volta and the Dillinger Escape Plan. You know, I mean, Enchant, even the 90s, Shadow Gallery, Enchant, they're American, so they won't be talked about, and they were pretty popular, even in Europe, in the 90s. You know, that's kind of my, you know, there's so many, like, just bands that they could cover. That's why I kind of see my blog, altmediareviews.blogspot.com, and these other bloggers like Lorenzo, who cover a lot of, like, Bubble Math, you know, but he talks about, when have they ever talked about Bubble Math in PROG magazine? Never. Bryce plays drums, although there was someone in Europe, and I found a podcast about that mentioned Bryce plays drums. You know, I have a Minnesota bias, they're from my hometown, but I'm sorry, I'd put, you know, especially their second album, The Man in the Animal Kingdom, is up against any record from the last decade. You know, they're doing PROG, they should be covered by your magazine. Are they? Have they ever crossed their radar? They should have like a readers thing where you can either email or write to them. suggested artists. But no, I guess maybe it's because they have to sell stuff. The artist has to be big enough. The Deer Hunter ever gets big enough, they're probably not going to have a choice. They're going to have to feature them. Because the Deer Hunter keeps on getting a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger. They're not really a household name, but if they can headline a full tour in the U.S. and in Europe, then they're probably big enough. But I mean, it's a broken record. I don't know. I mean, there's a long list. I'm just looking at, just trying to, the Reign of Kindo. Why have they never talked about the Reign of Kindo? They have a cult following online. And they toured, or even like Scale the Summit. They probably mentioned them because they toured with Dream Theater. Some of the bands that had toured with bigger names, I mean, Foals and everything, both European bands. I wouldn't be surprised if they mentioned, but I haven't followed their magazine close enough. There's just a laundry list of just the last 10 years. Let's forget about even Enchant and Shadow Gallery and the bands from the Liquid Tension Experiment, bands from the 90s and early 2000s. Let's just take the last 10 years. I mean, there's just so much music that's going on that they really want to cover music that's being progressive. The post-rock scene, you name that, besides the bands from Europe. They probably have talked about, like, they mentioned Sigur Rós or Mogwai. But, they're from the U.S. Godspeed You Black Emperor, Are they prog? No. Are they influenced by Yes? Yes, definitely. So that's my biggest beef with PROG Magazine, and it probably will continue to be, and you have these quote-unquote PROG Awards. I don't mind noticing, like, John Anderson getting an award, and I guess Andy Summers showed up, which is nice, but again, he's British. He played with Robert Fripp, but I love the Police. And they honored the Buggles, which, again, they're not prog, but of course, the Buggles guys were on the Drama album from Yes. So I totally at least give them credit for that, and it's one of my favorite Yes albums. It's not, the Buggles weren't prog, but I guess they influenced a lot of bands that were doing a lot of that stuff, that kind of electronic stuff in the 80s that were being progressive. So they sort of fall, and plus, Trevor Horn, his relationship with Yes is so strong anyways, and Jeff Downes, of course, being part of Asia and Yes, kind of fits, but the Tea Party. I mean, the Tea Party put out an album a couple years ago. Did they mention it? I highly doubt it. An awesome record. One of the best records of the last decade, for sure. Called The Ocean at the End. I mean, there's so many bands. Have they ever talked about even any of the chamber stuff, like Sufjan Stevens, Anathello, Margot the Nuku So-and-So's, Typhoon? Is it prog? Is it prog in the sense where they're all about technicality? No, but it is progressive in the sense they're using a lot of different instruments to kind of make it complex but interesting instrumentally. In that sense, it is prog, and I would argue that to anyone. Although the Polyphonic Spree, I've kind of concluded that while they do use a ton of different instruments, a lot of their music is sort of in a major key, and it doesn't really venture outside of sort of typical time signatures. But I still would say, some of these other chamber bands that keep on popping up, Mother Falcon, the Family Crest, that is progressive to me, and it hasn't been talked about in their magazine. It hasn't been talked about in progressive rock circles that much, which is just sad. The Deer Hunter does. They've used similar kind of instrumentation, but they also do other things. It's a conceptual thing, so I think it fits. But, I don't see why not. I don't see why more people that love a lot of this stuff wouldn't at least have an interest in a lot of what I call chamber, baroque, rock, pop, folk music. So, anyway, that's my rant for today. If you have any other thoughts about that, please let me know. Please comment, subscribe, and like this, and we'll see you next time.